Bruce Crandall had already pulled his helicopter away from landing zone X-ray when the radio made the situation plain. The battalion on the ground was taking casualties faster than it could move them. Ammunition was running low. Water was running low. The landing zone had been closed again because enemy fire was cutting across it, and the wounded were collecting in a small patch of ground that was supposed to be the safest place inside the perimeter. Crandall was no longer over the worst of it. His Huey was headed away from the valley. He could keep going. Instead, he began working out how to go back. There is a detail here that matters, because the familiar version has been repeated so often that it has started to hide the real problem. Crandall's aircraft was not a marked dust-off helicopter. It belonged to Company A, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. It was a troop-carrying slick, unarmored in the way people often imagine armored aircraft, with door gunners and enough room to carry soldiers, ammunition, water, or wounded men. The dedicated medical evacuation crews were nearby. They were not cowards, and they had not simply decided the landing zone was too dangerous. At that stage of the war, the 1st Cavalry Division had a policy that medical evacuation aircraft were not to enter a landing zone until it had gone 5 uninterrupted minutes without incoming fire. The policy was meant to protect scarce medical helicopters and crews. At X-ray, 5 quiet minutes might as well have been 5 hours. So Crandall faced a problem that did not fit the normal arrangement. The medical crews could carry wounded from a safer point to a hospital. They could not yet make the first pickup inside the fire. His assault helicopters could enter with ammunition and leave with casualties. But every return meant putting the same aircraft and crews back into a place the ground commander kept closing. The question was not whether a helicopter could reach X-ray once. Crandall had already done that. The question was how many times he could send men back before the valley took an aircraft, a crew, or both. He was the commander of A Company's flight operation that day, flying under the call sign Ancient Serpent 6. The helicopters had begun the morning carrying Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, into the clearing. The first lifts had seemed almost routine. Then, North Vietnamese fire began striking the landing zone, and the mission changed while the aircraft were still delivering the battalion. By the 5th lift, the fire was heavy enough that helicopters were being hit as they came in. The second group was ordered to turn away. Crandall's aircraft got out, but the men left behind were now engaged with a force much larger than anyone had expected. At a place called Landing Zone Falcon, only a few miles from X-ray, Crandall reorganized the entire job. That move is the hinge of the story. Camp Holloway, where the wounded could receive treatment and where supplies were available, was roughly 36 miles from X-ray. A helicopter could make the trip, but the time added up. Flying all the way to Holloway, loading, returning to the battle, landing under fire, and then taking wounded back again, was too slow for the rate at which Moore's battalion was using ammunition and producing casualties. Falcon was close. If ammunition, water, and medical supplies could be stockpiled there, the assault Hueys could shuttle between Falcon and X-ray in a matter of minutes. Wounded men could be carried out to Falcon, transferred to medical evacuation aircraft, and then flown to the clearing station at Camp Holloway. It was not the clean system anybody would have designed in advance. It was the system the battle allowed. Crandall asked for volunteers. Captain Ed Freeman stepped forward. Freeman was tall enough that the men called him too tall. He had served as an infantryman before becoming an aviator, and that background mattered. He knew what it meant to be on the ground, listening for helicopters. He knew the difference between an aircraft somewhere in the sky and an aircraft actually coming for you. Neither man needed a speech about duty. The radio was giving them the work. They began loading everything the battalion needed. Ammunition went in. Water went in. Medical supplies went in. The aircraft was packed for the trip to X-ray, then emptied and repacked in the opposite direction with wounded men. That rhythm would repeat for the rest of the day. The first problem was getting back into the landing zone. X-ray was not a prepared airfield. It was a clearing roughly the size needed for several helicopters, surrounded by tall grass, brush, trees, and rising ground. The enemy was close enough to fire directly into it. Smoke, dust, rotor wash, men moving, and aircraft arriving from different directions made the usable space smaller than it appeared from the air. A pilot approaching a hot landing zone does not only aim for the ground. He has to read the whole situation at once. Where is the friendly perimeter? Where is the fire coming from? Is another helicopter pulling out? Are wounded men already being carried toward the pickup point? Is there enough room to put the skids down, hold the aircraft steady, unload supplies, take casualties, and leave before the enemy adjusts? Crandall and Freeman were flying unarmed helicopters in the sense that the pilots had no weapon system to fire from the cockpit. Their slicks did have door gunners, but those gunners could not make the landing zone safe. They could suppress visible threats and protect the aircraft during the approach and departure. They could not remove every rifle, machine gun, or mortar crew hidden around the clearing. Each landing remained a negotiation with seconds. The Huey came in, flared, settled, and the ground crews moved immediately. There was no medical crew in back, waiting to begin full treatment. Again, this was not a dust-off aircraft. Infantrymen and crew members loaded the wounded as quickly as the situation allowed. Men who could move helped men who could not. Litters took space. Ammunition boxes took space. Water took space. Every pound going in affected what could come out. The aircraft commander had to know when the helicopter was becoming too heavy for the conditions. A Huey does not lift the same way at every altitude, temperature, or load. At X-ray, the crew had to get off the ground with wounded men aboard while fire continued around them. Staying down another 10 seconds might allow one more casualty to be loaded. It might also give an enemy gunner time to settle his aim. That decision belonged to the aircraft commander, but it was built from what everyone could see. The crew chief watched the helicopter and helped manage the cabin. Docker gunners watched the edges of the landing zone and the tree line. The co-pilot helped with the approach, radios, and aircraft systems. Men on the ground pushed litters in and cleared the doors. The pilot held the machine where it needed to be despite rotor wash, movement, noise, and incoming fire. Then the Huey lifted with whatever wounded men had made it aboard. The medic was waiting at Falcon. That transfer point is one of the least dramatic parts of the story, which may be why it is so often left out. It is also the part that made the rescue system work. Crandall and Freeman carried wounded men from the hot landing zone to Falcon. The dedicated medical evacuation crews then took them to Camp Holloway, where Company C of the 15th Medical Battalion had its clearing station. Men requiring more advanced care could be moved again, generally by fixed-wing aircraft, to the 85th Evacuation Hospital at Quignon. A wounded soldier might pass through several sets of hands before reaching an operating room. The first hands had to get him out of X-ray. Crandall returned again. Freeman returned again. On the way in, their aircraft carried what the battalion needed to keep fighting. On the way out, they carried men whose chance of surviving depended partly on how quickly the entire chain could move. The window kept narrowing. Enemy fire intensified, then shifted. The landing zone closed, then reopened briefly. Aircraft damage accumulated. Daylight began moving toward evening. The battalion's ammunition needs did not slow because the helicopter crews were tired. The wounded did not stop arriving because Falcon had become crowded. Every trip removed one option. Fuel was burned. Flying time accumulated. Crews became more tired. The light became worse. The enemy had more chances to study the approach. The sensible reason to stop grew stronger with every return. The reason to continue was waiting beside the landing zone. This is where the story can easily be turned into a piece of legend. A pilot ignores fear, charges into certain death, and comes out untouched. That version is simpler than what happened, and less respectful to the skill involved. Crandall did not survive the day because danger failed to register. He kept changing the way the operation worked. He moved the staging point closer. He organized volunteers. He coordinated with the ground force. He used short cycles between Falcon and X-ray. He kept supplies moving in the same aircraft that carried casualties out. Courage was present. So was logistics. Without the logistics, courage would have produced fewer flights and more dead men. Ed Freeman's role developed inside that same system. He flew 14 missions into X-ray during the day. His Medal of Honor citation later credited him with evacuating an estimated 30 seriously wounded soldiers, some of whom were believed unlikely to have survived without those flights. Crandall made 22 flights into the landing zone over roughly 14 hours. Together, the shuttle they led removed an estimated 70 wounded men, while also carrying ammunition, water, and medical supplies to the surrounded battalion. Those totals matter, though they can make the operation sound cleaner than it was. 70 men did not appear as one group waiting beside a helicopter pad. They came in pieces. One man on a litter, another supported under both arms, a soldier with a bandage already soaked through, a man who could still talk, a man who could not. A crew did not know, while loading them, which one would later be counted among the lives saved by speed. They only knew the aircraft had room for a certain number. The battalion needed more supplies, and the landing zone was under fire. Somebody had to choose who moved first. The most severely wounded normally received priority, but battlefield evacuation does not always present a neat line of patients arranged by medical urgency. Men were spread around the perimeter. Some could not be reached immediately. Others were in positions where moving them exposed the people carrying them. The battalion aid station had to keep treating casualties while preparing them for flights that might be delayed, interrupted, or canceled by fire. The helicopter crews could not solve those choices from the air. They could only return often enough to give the ground medics another chance. That is what dust-off meant to soldiers in Vietnam, even when the aircraft doing the pickup was not wearing medical markings. It was not a promise that every man would live. It was the practical belief that if someone could reach you, load you, and keep an aircraft flying, the chain back to surgery existed. At X-ray, Crandall and Freeman became the first link in that chain, because the normal first link could not operate under the policy then in place. Later accounts sometimes said the medical evacuation crews refused to enter the landing zone. The surviving pilots and the 15th Medical Battalion's own historians strongly disputed that wording. The issue was a command policy requiring a green landing zone, not a failure of nerve by individual crews. Hal Moore himself later stated that he did not call medical evacuation helicopters frequently that afternoon because the landing zone was under fire most of the time. That distinction matters. The dust-off crews at Falcon were working too. They received the casualties from Crandall and Freeman and carried them on to treatment. Later, when the fire at X-ray eased enough, medical evacuation Hueys did land there directly. Over the next several days, those crews flew repeatedly from X-ray, Albany, and Columbus. The operation was a relay. One group took the risk the hot landing zone required. Another carried the patients the longer distance and provided medical care. The hospital teams received them. No one part deserves to erase the others. By evening, the rescue work had become harder to see from the ground. Daylight faded. Smoke hung over the area. The helicopters still had to identify the clearing, avoid other aircraft, and land where Moore's men could reach them. Crandall's 22 landings continued until about 10:30 that night. Think about the change from the first flight of the morning to the last. The same valley had become a battlefield. The same landing zone was crowded with dead, wounded, ammunition, torn equipment, and men who had been fighting for hours. The crew had accumulated a full day of noise, vibration, near misses, and repeated approaches under fire. The last trip still required a steady hover. The last casualty still had to be loaded. The last takeoff still required enough power to clear the obstacles around the zone. The body does not care that the mission is important. Hands get tired. Eyes get tired. Judgment can narrow. A pilot can begin reacting a fraction of a second slower without noticing it. That is why the number of trips says more than a single dramatic landing. Going in once can come from urgency. Going back 14 times, or 22, requires a crew to perform the same difficult work after the shock of the first trip has worn off, and the risk is fully understood. I imagine a number of viewers remember hearing the phrase "dust off" over a radio, or knew someone who did. I'd like you to be very specific in the comments. What did that call mean to the men around you at the time? Did it bring relief, more urgency, silence, or something else? Use the words people actually used then. Those details are worth preserving. The results of the shuttle were visible before the battle ended. Moore's battalion received the ammunition and water it needed to hold its perimeter. Wounded soldiers reached Falcon, then Camp Holloway, and some went onward to Quignon. The ground force survived the first day and continued fighting through attacks that followed. Crandall and Freeman did not end the battle. They made it possible for other men to remain in it and for wounded men to leave it. There is no clean way to separate those two outcomes. A box of ammunition going in might keep a platoon from being overrun. A wounded man coming out freed soldiers who had been carrying or protecting him. Water kept exhausted men functioning. Medical supplies bought time for casualties who could not yet be moved. Every flight carried both sides of the battalion's survival. Years later, Crandall and Freeman received the Medal of Honor. Freeman's award was presented in 2001. Crandall's followed in 2007. The delay meant that many of the men who had been on the ground had spent decades knowing what the flights meant before the country formally recognized them. The citations used large words because citations are written that way. The men at X-ray remembered rotor blades. They remembered the aircraft appearing over the clearing. They remembered ammunition being thrown out. They remembered wounded men being pushed in. They remembered the Hueys lifting, turning away from the valley, and then coming back again. The dedicated medical evacuation crews also remembered the story differently from the popular version. They remembered being placed under a rule that prevented them from entering a hot landing zone. They remembered carrying wounded from Falcon to Holloway. They remembered going into X-ray when conditions finally permitted it, and flying through the days that followed. History sometimes makes one group look braver by making another group look worse. The record at Ia Drang does not need that. Crandall and Freeman were brave enough without calling the dust-off pilots cowards. The medical crews did essential work without pretending they made the first hot pickups. The truth is stronger because the rescue required both. By the end of the fighting around X-ray, Albany, and Columbus, hundreds of wounded men had been evacuated from the Ia Drang Valley. The medical system had been tested under conditions more severe than the division had expected. Policies changed afterward. Medical evacuation aircraft later received door guns and gunners, and the green landing zone restriction was dropped. That change came from what the battle had exposed. A rule designed to preserve rescue aircraft had left a gap at the exact moment the wounded most needed one. Crandall and Freeman filled it with assault Hueys. They did not have a medic working in the cabin. They did not have a Red Cross on the aircraft. They did not leave X-ray for the hospital. They carried the wounded 5 miles to Falcon, where the medical crews took over. It was not a perfect rescue. It was a chain built while men were bleeding. Crandall's aircraft completed 22 landings that day. Freeman completed 14. Their shuttle brought out an estimated 70 wounded soldiers. Freeman's 14 flights alone were credited with removing about 30 seriously wounded men. Those are the concrete results. The detail that stays with me is smaller. Every time a Huey left X-ray, the crew had reached safety compared with the men still on the ground. Then they turned the aircraft around.